From Vermont Public, this is The Frequency. I'm Mary Engish, filling in for Mitch Wortley. It's Saturday, January 27th, which means you're listening to a special weekend edition of the podcast featuring the Capitol Recap. Coming up, school taxes are expected to spike next year, which could lead to chaos on town meeting day. More on that after this.
Support for The Frequency comes from the Vermont Department of Liquor and Lottery, who manages Vermont's 802 Spirits liquor stores and contributes 100% of profits to the general fund, providing over $300 million to help benefit local communities.
The most recent forecasts predict that school taxes could rise on average 17% next year. Last week, two high-ranking Democrats sent a letter to districts urging school boards to trim their budgets. And then this Thursday, House and Senate lawmakers held a 2-hour hearing, taking testimony from school districts across the state as spending rises at an unprecedented rate. Vermont Public's education reporter Lola Dufour joins me for this week's edition of the Capitol Recap to explain how this budget cycle is unfolding at the local level and in Montpelier. Welcome.
Hey, Mary.
What kind of reaction did lawmakers get on Thursday from school officials? Like, who last week received that letter essentially chastising them for spending too much money?
Yeah, so several school officials noted the timing is not great. A lot of school boards have already adopted proposed budgets and are about to send them off to the printers ahead of town meeting day deadlines. So there really isn't a lot of time to make adjustments. And a number of superintendents argued that schools are also increasingly asked to do so much more than just educate kids. They've really become social service hubs. Here's Elaine Collins, the superintendent for North Country Schools, from Thursday's hearing.
Schools have been asked in the last 10 to 15 years to do much more than school our children. And that is really where the increase of education spending is coming from.
Plus, schools are dealing with a ton of inflationary pressure that's really out of their control. Healthcare costs, for example. But otherwise, reactions were actually pretty mixed. And in fact, certain districts on some level actually kind of welcomed this intervention from lawmakers.
Wait, are you serious about that? Explain more about that.
Yeah. But I think in order to explain why that might be, we actually need to step back and try to understand Vermont's very wonky system for funding schools.
Okay, I love a good explainer, so go ahead.
So in Vermont, local voters decide how much their individual district will spend. And then whatever amount they greenlight, and I mean whatever amount, the state must pay it. So to foot this bill, which now in the aggregate totals more than $2 billion annually, Vermont has built this statewide pool of money called the Education Fund. And to figure out each town's fair share into this fund, the state calculates how much each district is spending per pupil. If your town has high per pupil costs, your tax rate goes up relative to the rate of residents in other towns. So far, so good?
Yeah. Keep going. I'm pretty much following it so far, but I feel like it's going to get more complicated as you explain.
It is going to get more complicated because that per pupil cost is not straightforward. To calculate it, the state uses a weighted formula that tries to account for the fact that some kids should actually cost more to educate. So basically, it weighs some kids, for example, those who are low income, more heavily. And with the new funding law that was passed in 2022, that's Act 127, lawmakers actually retooled this weighting formula because they wanted to encourage districts with higher need students to spend more. Now, the cost of that is that other, more affluent districts will need to be taxed at a higher rate, or they'll need to spend a lot less. And the problem right now is that lawmakers wanted to give those affluent districts some time to adjust. So they included a provision that year-over-year homestead property tax rate increases were capped at 5% for 5 years. Now, that 5% isn't like a hard cap. It's complicated. But for the sake of simplicity, we're going to just call it 5. And now a lot of people are concerned that this cap is actually encouraging wealthier districts to spend more in the short term. Because right now, if your tax rate is artificially capped, even if, you spend more, but in the future, it's probably going to go up by a lot to help fund, lower income districts, you have an incentive to front load as many costs as you can.
Can you give me an example of how it all works out?
Yeah. So a common thing that's come up is school facilities. Vermont schools are old and they're rapidly deteriorating. And there's no state aid to defray bonding costs. So a lot of districts thought to themselves, hey, why don't we use this one-time opportunity when our taxes are artificially capped to raise a bunch of money and park some of it in a reserve fund? That way, that'll lower our costs in the future. And if you're only thinking about your district and your taxpayers, that's actually probably a smart thing to do. The problem is that if enough districts do this all at once, the aggregate impact is really problematic. That's the point that Brooke Olson-Farrell, a superintendent in Rutland County, made to me in an interview on Wednesday.
I don't think any school district is doing this maliciously or with, it's all well intended. I think it's just the ripple effect that it's having across the state, and folks have not fully realized the true implications of decisions that are being made at the local level.
So now, to close this loop, when I said that some school districts actually welcomed this letter that lawmakers sent, what I'm talking about is districts like Olson-Farrell's that were supposed to reap the benefits of Act 127 this year. They're upset because the spending in neighboring districts, because of that cap, is putting so much pressure on the education fund that it's raising everyone's taxes and essentially canceling out the benefits they were supposed to see.
Okay, I think I'm following. So the law that was supposed to temper education spending in those wealthier communities and help out less affluent districts is actually leading to a surge in spending and big tax increases everywhere. Is that kind of how this is playing out?
Yeah, exactly. So poorer districts are saying, hey, can you do something about this cap? And more affluent districts are saying the opposite. They're saying absolutely do not touch this cap. And also, can you do something about the fact that, in 5 years when it expires, our taxes are going to skyrocket? So it's a mess. And this town meeting day, we could see a lot of budgets fail.
That was Vermont Public Education reporter Lola DeFore breaking down school funding issues for this week's edition of the Capitol Recap. And you can find other legislative coverage from our team of reporters in Montpelier at vermontpublic.org. Lola, this was really fascinating. Thank you so much for your reporting on this and for helping walk us through it.
Thanks, Mary.
Thanks for listening to The Frequency today. Our executive producer is Kevin Trevelin, and our music is by Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Mary Angish. Talk to you later.
Every episode of Brave Little State begins with a question about Vermont that's been submitted and voted on by listeners like you. What happened to all the restaurant workers? What's the deal with Vermont's fire towers? Why do people like the band Phish? Follow Brave Little State wherever you get podcasts. From Vermont Public, part of the NPR network.